Hey, welcome to today's talk at Google. I'm Sunni Yuen. I'm a member of Google's legal team and also a member of the Talks team. And this is Manushi Shah, who's a software engineer and also a member. And today we're here to welcome Nikhil Goyal. Nikhil Goyal is a 20-year-old education activist who has been lauded by the Washington Post as the future education secretary. No pressure there. And also named by Forbes as one of the top 30 under 30 list. Nikhil is known for his passionate viewpoints on the existing American education system, K-12, and his bold ideas for how to revolutionize it. So welcome, Nikhil.
Thanks for having me. So I'd love to talk for just a couple of minutes, and then we could jump into a more extended Q&A and more conversation-based format. So to give a little background on my story, I graduated from Syosset High School on Long Island in January 2013. It's a fairly high-ranking high school. A lot of kids go on to Ivy League institutions. It's one of the highest ranking on the Newsweek rankings, at least. And at school, I became very frustrated with the way schooling was done, and I noticed a couple of things. One, that students at my school, they were incredibly stressed out, they were depressed, anxious, they were hooked on prescription drugs. They were overall really unhealthy human beings, and they were sacrificing a lot of their sleep, mental health, well-being, and happiness in order for this one pursuit of getting into college. So everything in terms of their grades, their extracurricular activities was dedicated to padding their college application. And I felt that this was a very artificial and not so worthwhile task, that you're losing a lot of the joy and creativity in learning when you are single-handedly pursuing this goal that may not lead to necessarily success later on in life. And I was looking at these problems. I was talking to teachers. I was speaking with students about what do they think about their schooling experiences, their problems with the system, their critiques of it. And that just led me to do research on the American education system. I was somebody who, throughout my time in school, was somebody who did not really enjoy school very much. I found it to be very boring, alienating, and oftentimes did not really satisfy what I was most interested in, which was politics and current affairs and international relations, these topics were not discussed at all in the regular school day. But what was quite interesting and what I learned in high school was that I found the most worthwhile experiences to be after school. So in my forensic speech and debate team, or my cross-country team, where I was a runner all year long, or going on the Model Yuen team, those kinds of experiences where I was allowed to engage in experiential, hands-on, project-based learning experiences, where I was allowed to work with people of different ages, where I was allowed to use the real world as my classroom as opposed to sitting in a school building. Those experiences really gave me a better insight on how the world works, how social change happens, and just how you can acquire the skills necessary for adult life. And those experiences, I was just wondering, why can't this be the school day itself? I'm making so many friends. I'm enjoying myself. Why is it that I'm finding myself to be so bored in my regular classes? Couldn't there be a better option? And just that basic curiosity of, like, could the system be better? Like, is there a better system out there? And how can we bring it to more places? Really drove my thinking and my research. So I graduated from high school in January 2013. And after that, basically what I did was go around the country. I went to cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, San Francisco, and I visited something called democratic, progressive, and free schools. And these are schools that are basically schools that focus on self-directed learning. They believe that the school should not be divorced from the classroom. They should be from the community. They should be deeply ingrained with one another. That adults and students should have reciprocal relationships. That there should be some kind of democratic process. So in some of these schools, the students vote on school policies in something called a democratic meeting. And just a really radical idea of how education is done. And it harkens back to the idea of progressive democratic education, which has been in this country for a very long time. Some of you may be familiar with a man named John Dewey or Maria Montessori. And these were kind of the two pioneers of progressive education in the in the 20th century. John Dewey with the U Chicago Lab School and the Montessori in Italy and a number of schools around the world, thousands of them. And that was a very big point in a very big period in the 20th century. And in the 1960s, you had this movement called the free school movement, which basically coincided with the anti-war movement, I guess Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, student power movements, just a really big time for transformation, revolution, and protest. And so one of the overlooked movements, one of the things that's often not mentioned in the history books, is the free school movement. And the free school movement was a movement that was dedicated to completely transforming the education system from the ground up. And the person who kind of led this movement and who kind of inspired it from the beginning was a man named A.S. Neal. And A.S. Neal basically was a British educator who was a teacher for a long period of time and was very frustrated with how education was done. He dropped out of the teaching profession many times, and he was very alienated by the way kids were learning in school and how they were treated. At the time, corporal punishment was very, very widespread in British schools. And so A.S. Neal, in 1921, he started a school called Summerhill. And Summerhill was a school, it was first founded in Germany, and then they moved to England a couple of years later. And it remains there today. It's going to be celebrating their 100th anniversary in a couple of years. And this is a school, it was a very, very radical school at the time. Like I mentioned, this school they feature non-compulsory classes, so students did not have to necessarily go to class at all during their entire time at school. There was equal relationships between students and teachers. There was democratic process, so maybe twice a week, the students come together as a school community and vote on school policies. And then there's all this ample time for play. I mean, I think one of the great things about this school and many of these free schools is that they let children really truly live out their childhood and get to explore and find their passions at a very young age, as opposed to chaining them to a desk and telling them, you have to learn this at this time, you have to read it by this age, and you have to be able to accomplish basic skills. And the evidence suggests, I've been to many of these schools, and it's not just anecdotal, but the evidence suggests, based on a lot of research by people like Peter Gray, is that the kids in these schools, even though they necessarily weren't forced to take classes, they overwhelmingly learn the formal skills, so reading, basic literacy, writing, math, numeracy, and so much more, even if they're not forced to, because what happens is that when you create an environment where there's a lot of opportunities for learning, for play, for peer-to-peer learning, because there's no age segregation in these schools. The older kids and the younger kids intermix and mingle with each other. When you have those kinds of factors and principles in place, you create a system where the kids not only learn more efficiently, but they retain the curiosity, the creativity, the intrinsic motivation that I think all children are born with. And it's formal schooling that oftentimes leads to the appreciation of that engagement and curiosity. And so what I found, what I wanted to do in the book was do two things. One, expose and show the problems with American education and just conventional schooling in general, and then offer this blueprint of where education is actually succeeding, where is it being very effective. And in the former, I show a lot of evidence and data that suggests that, for example, student engagement. The levels of student engagement, if you look at the chart, Gallup did this study a couple of years ago. They call it a school cliff, where if you look at student engagement from kindergarten to 12th grade, it is a downward spiral as you go through more years of schooling. Curiosity is the same way, creativity, asking questions. The number of questions kids ask decrease as they go through formal schooling. Obviously, it's not necessarily for everyone. Not everyone has this happening to them. But across the board, this is a systematic problem. So I was looking at the problems of the American schooling system. I was looking at the history. Where was the system created? What was the purposes of it? And then I wanted to show that there is another education system that's possible. And there's Montessori schools or Waldorf schools. They call them just progressive schools, the free school movement. And many of these, I mean, there's thousands of these schools around the country. But the big problem is that a lot of these schools are private schools. So they are largely inaccessible to the population that arguably needs it the most, which is poor children of color, which are generally, as you may have seen, are in the schools where it's very regimented. They are basically doing test prep for 6 to 7 hours a day. They have to walk in hallways with their hands behind their backs because they fear that if the student is not able to cooperate and act in a disciplined and obedient fashion, they're not going to be able to do well in life. The New York Times just showed this video of a teacher at Success Academy, a school that's predominantly for poor black and brown children, harassing a child. And I think this is a systematic problem at many of these schools that deal with children of color. So my mission and my objective with this book and with my writing and my reporting is to show that progressive education should be able to reach the most vulnerable people in our society. And one of the examples I show is there's a group of schools actually in New York State called the New York State Performance Consortium, Standards Consortium. And this is a group of public progressive schools that basically have been given a waiver by New York State where they only have to take one Regents exam, which is the English one. And instead of the other Regents exams, they get to submit a portfolio of, say, a science paper, a science project, a history paper, a math proof, really performance-based tasks that show what a student can accomplish. And I arguably think this is much better than what any standardized test can show a student. And what they find is that these schools generally work with a population that has been disengaged, that is poor, that is special education, and minority students. And even when you consider those stats, the students do better in terms of graduation rates. They have lower dropout rates, higher student engagement rates, and arguably they do better in college than students in comparative public schools. So I think, that's one of the things I'm looking at in the future. I'm hoping to study that and study progressive education, at least in communities of color, and how we can bring about these changes not only in the private system, but in the public system where I think most kids are, and where I think we need to see a major transformation. And I'll just end on this. One of my ideal visions for education is treating the city and the community as the classroom itself. So there was in the 60s, during that period of time, there was a group of schools called School Without Walls. A School Without Walls, there was one in Philly, for example, basically believed that the community should be the classroom. So the kids spent most of their time in museums, in libraries, in art galleries, in athletic centers, in bakeries, in all parts of the community and the city, and that's where they learned. They obviously did have some formal classes, but they learned based on side-by-side mentorship and apprenticeship and experiential learning. And it was just really incredible because kids who were formerly disengaged, kids who were ready to drop out of school, came to these places like the School Without Walls, and they became completely re-energized by the idea of learning. So I'd love to see this idea of a city as a classroom. And I think the writers, like I mentioned, in the 60s, you have Jonathan Kozol, Herbert Cole, John Holt, Paul Goodman. These ideas were hashed out and debated very thoroughly in the 60s. Between 1968 and 1972, these ideas were on the front pages of the New York Times. So these are not necessarily new ideas. They're just, I think I update them for the 21st century society that we live in. So I'm looking forward to seeing how these changes come about. And I think there's another education system that is possible if we have the political will and we have the movement coming from parents, educators, students, and policymakers for a more progressive and democratic education system.
So you may be one of the few people who, after graduating from high school, went back to school.
Right.
Many schools. For
Right.
a year of traveling, going to schools.
Right,
You
right.
couldn't get enough of it.
Well, what I wanted to do was not go to the schools that were like mine because I found that to be very depressing. If you go to any American high school, the kids are either they're high or they're on some kind of drug or they're sleep deprived. They're hunched over. It's like zombies essentially in many of these high achieving high schools. And I didn't want to see that again. And I wanted to see where are the kids happy. One of the things, it's really funny because I quote this principal at the workshop school in Philadelphia. It's a progressive school, and one day there was the superintendent of schools in Philly was touring a school, which is an amazing, amazing school for poor kids in West Philly. And the first thing that superintendent said, "Oh, the kids are happy." And then Simon Hogger, who's the principal, goes and says, "Oh, actually, this guy goes to schools every day and he notices that kids aren't happy and they're bored to death every day. And here he comes to this school and the kids are engaged and very interested in learning." It's a very stark contrast to what you see in most American high schools. So I wanted to see the other side of this and see where the kids are actually achieving very well. And I think I found some really good answers and solutions that I hope more people learn about.
And did you set off on this school road trip, which sounds kind of like an oxymoron? Did you set on this road trip knowing that you wanted to write a book based on what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write about it in some form. As I went to these schools, I noticed that one of my main purposes was to bring the ideas of the 60s back. I wanted to show that these ideas that what they talked about, what Kozel and Holt and Illich talked about in the 60s, are very, very relevant to today. Like, I quote a lot of these people, and people are saying, "Oh, why are you quoting people from 1965? Like, how are they even relevant?" But if you read those books, it's quite interesting because almost word for word, they're still applicable to the education system today, primarily because the system has largely remained the same in many forms and structures. I wanted to do that, and I wanted to show the public that there was another way possible.
And are you familiar with OutSchool, which was founded by a former Google engineer?
Yeah, it's. I've not visited one. I've heard some good things about it. I've heard some not so good things about it. I would like to visit one and see what it's like for person. I usually don't try to judge a school before I visit it.
That's very wise.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the OutSchool model is supposed to be concentrated on project-based learning, which is something that you advocate very strongly for in your book. And there's sort of this other element, which is premised on the idea of building personalized, curricula for students, and again, using data to create, it's very contemporary, right, for millennials, creating playlists. So students can just look at their homework. Instead of calling it homework, they look at their playlists, and they naturally, can build a project based on that. And the idea is that can scale, right? That model can scale based on the data that they have. They can model what's optimal for a given student based on their personality and stage. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm all in favor of tailoring an education to the individual. There's been a lot of worries about personalized learning. Personalized learning sounds like a really good idea, but the implementation has been very shaky. I find in the past couple of years, primarily because what happens is that if personalized learning just says, if you're going to learn this set curriculum and you're just going to learn it however you choose to, I don't think that's a very big leap in the right direction. I'm all in favor of kids learning what they would like to and crafting a curriculum based on those interests. But if the end goal is the same curriculum, then I don't think that's a very big iteration of the kind of current system we have. But yeah, I would love to see this. It's obviously still playing out in many schools around the country, and I'd love to see how it's going. But yeah, that's my big worry, because if we're just trying to meet this one goal and you get to decide however you want how to get to that goal, I take some issue with that. A lot of these progressive schools, they do have curriculums available, but they do let the kids really work with the teacher and the kind of school community at large to decide what's the best topic or what's the best way to approach a certain issue that I want to learn. So project-based learning is a great idea. I think it's practiced for many, many years. But I think one of the things that we need to consider, and I think one of the flaws of the progressive education community, is oftentimes not realizing that kids may prefer a more direct instruction approach. And I think we should have all options available to kids, even though project-based learning tends to be, I find, more effective and more engaging for kids who have been turned off by schools. But I think we should have as many options available for kids in school.
So just continuing on that, you've seen the progressive and democratic school success with, the range is usually in hundreds of students from kindergarten to high school. when you think about the current education system and the current school districts, they are in range of thousands of students.
Right.
If you try to continue the same motto of letting everyone vote on decisions, there will still be a cohort who's not happy with the overall decision
Right,
because
right.
it's such a huge
Yeah. Well,
cohort.
so
How would you handle that?
Yeah. So for the first part, I mean, like the big banks, I would like to break up the schools. I would, in terms of making them smaller, much smaller institutions. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to show that schools with under 250 students, or about 300 students, have smaller class sizes. They have strong relationships between students and teachers. And if you go to most American high schools, I mean, they are gargantuan institutions. I mean,
Right.
thousands upon thousands
Right.
of kids in the school. And what happens with that is that the kids are lost. They don't have they don't have true relationships with teachers and other students because they're just being shuffled from classroom to classroom, and there's not enough time for that kind of strong relationship building. So I'd love to make schools much smaller places, and a lot of these progressive schools are, I think one of the successes of them is because they are very small institutions, and that has a lot to do with funding and the way school districts are structured and taxes, and there's a lot of big obstacles to that. But I would really like to see smaller schools. And then, so for the second point, for the Democratic meeting, yeah, I mean, I think, what's great about these schools is that, obviously, yeah, there's always going to be some cohort of kids that don't like the decision, or some adult who doesn't like the decision. But, I mean, so to give an example, just to show, like, what these kids actually do, at the Philly Free School, one of the kids were interested in walking barefoot at the school. It's a very small school. And so one kid, I think like a 7-year-old, wanted to propose it. And he brought it to the school meeting, and people talked about it. I think they eventually voted it down. But they had this really good discussion about this issue. There were 7-year-olds debating 15-year-olds and adults debating each other. And eventually they came to a consensus that this wasn't the best idea. And at this school also, they have something called, it's kind of like a tribunal. So if a student, they have a set of rules. So if a student breaks a rule, they actually go to court in the school. There's a jury. I think there's 2 students and 1 adult on this jury. So for example, I believe one kid, he or she accidentally broke the ceiling fan, and the student didn't tell a staff member or anybody at the school, and it was a hazard. And so they brought the student up to the meeting. They allow the student to bring in witnesses or to vouch for their opinion and say, why did you do this? Like, what's the penalty? And they had this really good discussion about why, like, what was supposed to, like, letting the kid know that this was not right, that this was kind of restorative justice, that you need to figure out a way to mend the community back. And like it was a really amazing interaction between this 7-year-old or whatever age she was, and these adults and these students. I think restorative justice is a much better way to approach school discipline and punishment as opposed to zero tolerance policies, because zero tolerance policies, it disproportionately affects children of color, and it actually doesn't lead to a better outcome, because even if you just suspend a kid, they don't truly understand what they did wrong and how to rectify their mistake. And I think a lot of these schools really do a great job with restorative justice. And I think a Democratic meeting, obviously it's going to be harder on a scale if you have thousands of kids.
Right.
But I'd love to, I mean, there's a high school I mentioned in the book, Hanover High School, that I'm not sure how many students they have, but they have students elect representatives. Like they have a student council, where not like most American high schools where you have a student government, which is really based on popularity and oftentimes not very democratic, and the school administration kind of doesn't really care very much about them. This school, there's a very large student council where they have this big election at the beginning of the year, and they get to lobby the school board, and they have teachers on there. It's a really amazing democratic process, and the kids they debate all kinds of issues, from homework policy to testing, to installing a water fountain, like things like that. It's like a really interesting democratic fashion. So yeah, I'd love to see that happen in more schools.
But isn't the number of issues that arise is getting higher? So how do you handle those? Like, when you consider like each issue that 7-year-old to like 20-year-old is going to bring up in a democratic vote.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The example of Summer Hill School, for example, they actually have something called ombudsmen and petty officers. This is a boarding school. So an ombudsman is essentially a student who's elected. The individual has been at the school for at least 2 years. Usually an older student. And an ombudsman basically is charged with settling small disputes between students. And oftentimes it's between younger students, like just fighting or like just somebody called each other a name or like some small little thing. An ombudsman, who's an older kid, who's charged with settling that dispute and with making sure that kind of the tedious minor disputes don't go into the school meeting. Okay. And they have petty officers. So at this school, it's a boarding school. Petty officers wake up and put kids to bed. It's to make sure that they're not running around at night. And there's amazing, I think, because the older kids take on that responsibility, the community functions a lot better. And not every case makes it to the school meeting necessarily. The chair or the person who's coordinating the meeting has to decide whether this is reasonable or we can decide this in another fashion. So I think there is kind of structures in place to ensure that it doesn't get cobbled down by a lot of unnecessary cases.
So let's talk tests. It is the one thing I've left behind for good, hopefully. Maybe not. But you actually distinguish at length the difference between a test and an assessment. In your book, you say that a test is used to tell whether a student has memorized and regurgitated enough material, while an assessment is an ongoing process for evaluating, documenting, and reflecting. And so I am curious because it seems like your distinction and your arguments here hinge on sort of two distinct aspects. One which is format of a test and the purpose of a test. And I think anybody who has had to deal with a number 2 pencil and a Scantron sheet can probably say that at some point they've taken a multiple choice test, which was only created to test superficial knowledge,
right.
And also it was summative. It was meant for the purpose of determining what the final grade was. But is there any reason why a test can't be actually formative and a good gauge of a student's development?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. Well, I distinguish between the two just for the purposes of this argument, and this is a term I find that progressive schools, they don't use the term test necessarily. They use the term assessment, and assessment is more so performance-based tests or portfolio-based assessment, and that's what I think the kind of distinguishing factor is. Like a traditional standardized test, a multiple choice, or based on memorization. But I think I think there is a lot of debate and discussion around this issue. There are some. One of the things that's kind of interesting, I didn't mention in this book because it just happened. President Obama just signed the Every Student Succeeds Act back in December, and one of the things, and they use this language also, I believe, they say that schools can move. And some states are allowed to move away from traditional standardized tests towards more performance-based assessments. So that's where I think the language is more so used. So they can use portfolios or performance-based tests or experiential learning methods. It's more so different than a traditional standardized test. So I just think that's kind of the language that people are using these days.
So how do you feel about spelling bees? Do they need to go?
Well, I have nothing against spelling bees. Feel free to participate in spelling bee, but.
But do you think that they're only meant to test regurgitation?
It depends on the way you approach it, because a lot of times it does. There's a lot of evidence, but then there are. I've heard stories of kids who do the spelling bee and they use a very real life application base to it. Like they find contextual ways to learn those words without necessarily just kind of cramming the information. One of the things I mentioned, similar, not necessarily spelling bees, but the issue of rote memorization. And I think the evidence around acquiring and retaining information. There's a lot of evidence around project-based learning that shows that project-based learning actually leads to long-term retention because you're repeating the task over and over again, and you're solidifying the information with a real life application. So it has a real meaning to you as opposed to you just kind of did this at one time, you studied for the test, and this is it. So I think I think I personally find that the more the project-based learning experiences that I've had in school, like the after-school programs, I can remember that very vividly today, where I can't very much remember most of what I learned in chemistry class in 10th grade. So I think I'd love to see that happen in more schools.
Now, there are two testing consortia that have sort of arisen out of the Common Core work. One
Right.
which is the Partnership for Assessment Readiness for College and Careers, and Smarter Balanced. And these are consortia which are focused on developing tests that assess critical thinking and pathways to improvement rather than just rote memorization. Right. Do you think that they're on the right track to revolutionize standardized testing in a way that it could be formative rather than simply summative?
Well, I mean, I have not studied PARC. I believe it's PARC you're referring to. I have not studied that in depth, but what I've heard from parents is that there is a lot, and as well as many educators, there's a lot of concern about the way PARC is implementing their tests. I have not studied PARC very in depth, but I've just heard many concerns about that. But yeah, I mean, I think under this Every Student Succeeds Act, there is, I think, 7 states that are allowed to move away from standardized tests like the traditional forms. Right. So I think that's really good progress. I'd love to see that happen on a larger scale. But the other issue is accountability in terms of what these tests are used for. Like I find it very concerning when tests are used to assess and fire teachers, and also along the lines of grading schools, because when you find, I mean, a lot of these tests are very much so based on socioeconomic indicators. I mean, there's a lot of studies to show that teachers have a very small portion of the control over how well a student does. Like kids in high achieving communities generally do better on standardized tests because for a number of reasons. One is that the culture of and the language used on these tests is more resembling a more white middle class environment, whereas a poor kid is probably not going to get as much of success on these tests for a number of reasons because of their socioeconomic background. So I think standardized tests have a strong correlation. The SAT is a perfect example. I mean, if you look at family income as you go up the brackets, the standardized test scores go up. The SAT scores go up like in an upward fashion. So yeah, I think there's a lot of. I'm hopeful to see the changes that are happening under Every Student Succeeds, but I do worry about the kind of accountability structures that may result from that because teachers have been very, very angry about this. I mean, they've protested in numbers around the country around, they call them value-added evaluations, where right. the teacher is basically evaluated based on the kid's test score, and they can get fired for that.
But that's part of your criticism of the Race to the Top program, right? Where I think in your book you had mentioned that the $4 billion program passed as part of the stimulus package. You said that you felt that because of the size of the stimulus, and at a time when it was granted during the Great Recession a few years ago, that was basically strong-arming states into complying with policies promoted by the Race to the Top, so forth. Right. But the thing is that out of the initial sort of tier that was provided under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, of the $100 billion, $50 billion of that was actually dedicated and earmarked to save teacher jobs.
Well,
so how do you address that?
So first thing, Race to the Top, it was a piece of legislation, a $4.35 billion program started by Arne Duncan, who was the CEO of Chicago Schools. And the stimulus package, this was a massive package. As a person who was involved in education, as a person who follows education news, and talking to people who were very active at that time, did not know about Race to the Top. This was not a program that was very well known in the education community, and that's why there wasn't this kind of opposition to it from that forefront. In terms of the firing and teachers, I think there's a lot of really good, it did save a lot of teachers' jobs. But what I'm referring to is the value-added assessment, value-added evaluations, which have basically under Race to the Top, a state had to abide by certain principles. So one of them was the Common Core standards. Another one was implementing more charter schools.
Though actually, I think Race to the Top program never actually, by its terms, requires the adoption of the Common Core.
It doesn't say that, but
it encouraged states to develop standards, which is not exactly the same as Common Core.
It did say Common Core. I'm pretty sure it did say Common Core.
No.
But my point is that they strong-arm states into pushing for these. Arundhati was a proponent of these standards. He was a strong supporter of these standards at the time. But here's my point. My point is that the stimulus obviously did a lot of really good things. It saved a lot of jobs. But in New York State, for example, they did pass. They were one of the states that did receive the Race to the Top money, and they did implement value-added evaluations. And it's caused a lot of upheaval by educators. It's massive dissatisfaction with that system. When, like I said, there's a lot of evidence to show that standardized test scores are very much so tied to teacher evaluations. I mean, on the issue of firing and hiring teachers, there was early in Obama's term in 2009 in, I believe it was Central Falls, it was a very poor Rhode Island district. They fired all their teachers or most of their staff, and Obama and Duncan supported that measure. I mean, they were totally behind that because they found that this school district was very low performing, and there was massive backlash from the teachers union. So I mean, I read about that, Central Falls and Rhode Island. So yes, they did save jobs, but a lot of educators have been very critical of those changes.
So maybe it was an implementation issue.
Yeah, and I think it didn't include, I mean, my thing is, if you're going to talk about education policy, you're going to have to include the stakeholders in that conversation. They did not have enough of an effort to include the educators and students. People I know did not know about Race to the Top until it was passed. Like, it was not something that was very well known. Maybe that's part of the media, maybe it was part of the strategy, but it was not, I don't think it was developed in a way that necessarily was as cohesive as it could have been.
So just getting back to the whole idea of letting students learn by themselves, you're assuming that inherently they're just going to be interested in learning by themselves even at the age of 3 or 4, which is when they're most curious about things in life. How do you intend to force students who are not interested, like by the age of 11 or 12, they just don't want to learn anything? Like if you give them a choice of playing video games and watching TV, they might just defer to that instead of learning or doing any projects. So would you force them?
It's a very good question. So here's what I'd say. So first of all, children are natural learners. I mean, you go to any preschool, I mean, children are deeply engaged in the practice of learning. And play, I argue, is a very strong form of learning, at least in the early ages. But yeah, I think I give the example of the Brooklyn Free School. So I give talking about video games and television. The Brooklyn Free School, it's a private school with sliding scale tuition. I believe large population of color. They do offer a certain number of families free tuition, so they do have economic diversity in that form. And the school, one of the things I was wondering, it's a really good question where if you just let a kid kind of sit around, do whatever they want, are they just going to play video games? Mm-hmm. And what you find is that the kids who came from traditional schools, they come to this school and they see all this freedom. They go they gravitate towards the things that were basically controlled before. Mm-hmm. So they go to the video games. They play video games. They watch television. They're on the computer. They watch YouTube. They're not doing anything that's so-called productive in your sense. But what you find, I give the story of one student named Louise, and she did that for maybe a couple of months. She was just sitting around, and she was completely isolated from everyone else. And what happened was that she realized because of everyone else around her was engaging in learning. They were going on field trips. They were doing volunteer opportunities. There were classes available. Everyone else was engaged in some kind of activity, and she was just left alone. And it was this kind of peer pressure where she wanted to be part of the school community. And the students actually call it a period of detox. They literally call it that term where you have to kind of unlearn and relearn kind of what you're most interested in. And that process can take a very, very long time because if you just throw a kid into an unstructured environment from a structured environment, it's going to take a very long time for that transition to happen. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think the kids do learn, and they go through that period of detox, which is, I think, very important. And they do. I've not seen a case of that school, for example, that has they've just been left alone and not done any classes. But Summer Hill is also a very good example where I find many kids don't take a single formal lesson until 12 or 13 years old. For 6-7 years, they have not taken a single formal lesson. Yet the kids have learned how to read. They learn how to read through computer games, for example, Minecraft. Many kids learn reading through Minecraft. Or through play, or an older kid helped them out with the words and the letters, and they learn how to read, or through some kinds of means, or they may have taken a formal lesson at some point. Yet they've learned how to read and do basic literacy and numeracy by that point. And then at that time, there is this kind of realization amongst the student population that I need to begin to so-called formally prepare a little bit for college or adult life, and they begin to take classes. I mean, I've not seen a case when I was there for all the kids who were in the 13 to 15 demographic who weren't taking classes or who weren't preparing for something called the GCSE exams for college. So yeah, I think if you have a community where there is enough and ample opportunities for learning, and there are these kinds of structures in place to encourage kids to take on a more formal lesson, because kids are not somehow are not completely resistant to what adults think. I mean, they're oftentimes very intelligent human beings. They're not just if you encourage them and if you show them that here are some really good opportunities, then they will take them. So yeah, I think I would love to see more research done on this. A lot of this is unfortunately very anecdotal, but yeah, I would love to see more research on this issue.
But in that case, it's usually when you have a progressive school already in place where there are 100 kids who are learning this way, and then you put 2 or 3 students from traditional school who'll just follow this idea, but you can't just change the whole structure and expect them to be just undo that.
Right. So here's it's a good question because and a good point. What I would say is that I think the solution is to start pilot programs within existing schools themselves. So a lot of these schools, they have alternative education programs. In Great Neck on Long Island, they have the Village School, which is an alternative school that's been around for decades. So you create these kinds of progressive programs within the existing school buildings themselves, and then you work on expanding it. Because I'd love to see this, you try this out with, say, a group of kids who are really interested in doing this, and then you expand it to more and more kids. Or you try what the consortium schools are like, and you work with that kind of population of students who have been very disengaged by schools. But I think a pilot program is a much better option. There's a school in Massachusetts that started something called Independent Project, and this was a group of 10 high school students who wanted to be able to get away from the rules and the requirements that are required of them in the traditional school day. And so they wanted to work on their own projects. They decided, let's create our own school within the school. Let's have a couple of teachers and mentors available to us, and they did this. And I think something like that model, the Independent Project, which has been around for a couple of years now, can start in schools. So yes, you're right that if you just do this, you're not going to necessarily lead to the best results. But if you start with a group of students and you slowly expand that over time, I think that can lead to better outcomes in the future.
So what is this magic sort of age or epiphany when students who have gone through a very unstructured environment suddenly decide, oh, I want to study nuclear physics, so I'm going to have to develop a course of competencies, right? Because if you look at it, there's the adult world, which I think everybody in this room falls into. But what about doctors having to take the boards? Do we get rid of boards for doctors? Do they need to be qualified by taking an exam? Should lawyers like me have to take a bar exam? Why? What about accountants, architects? And even in education, I think the dean of Michigan's education school had said that there needs to be a common set of standards. And so the question is sort of how do you manage that transition from going from very individual, project-based, driven learning, right, into sort of where you've got a very structured world where the threshold to even become an architect, to become a chartered accountant, you have to take tests, and they're going to be standardized tests, and they're going to be hard and time pressured, and if you don't have that sort of practice going up through K through 12 at some point, you're just not going to be that
Right.
prepared. Does that mean we should invite the Kaplans of the world to take over that role?
It's a very good question. So what I find is that the kids in these progressive schools, they actually have a very easy time transitioning to college. I mean, obviously there's our examples, and I'm not in favor of getting rid of these board exams or requirements for
Doctors.
For doctors. I don't think that's even part of this solution. But if I just may mention, one of the things that they are, I was reading at medical schools is that they are trying to move to more qualitative measures of assessment because they're finding that they want to show the multidimensional facets of an individual.
But that's a school versus.
I know, but that's my point. My
licensing
point is that they're moving.
entity.
I think they're moving in that direction. But my point is that the students. I find that they have no difficulty taking standardized tests. At Summerhill, the kids take many GCSE exams for college. These are standardized exams.
Right.
And they find that in college, even if they're structured environments, the kids don't mind being there because they chose to be there. And the kids are, and they chose to be in that class, or they prefer that kind of style of learning. So they have, I don't find that they have any difficulty adapting to that environment. They actually say that the kids who were kind of forced into that, who never had the practice of choosing what they wanted to learn or taking more responsibility in learning, have difficulty going into those college classes. So yeah, I think there is a lot of evidence in that shows that even kids in progressive schools can do the more structured, standardized learning, and they do well in college and later on. I mean, you gave me the examples of doctors and lawyers, and maybe those are extreme examples, or like examples of certain professions where there is more standardization required of you.
Okay.
But there's doctors and lawyers that come out of these schools as well. So I think they can take on those challenges.
But do you think they're disadvantaged?
I don't think they're
sheer fact that they haven't, had as much practice at an earlier stage.
Well, I mean, if you're driven in test prep your entire life, you're going to be good at taking tests. But
That's exactly
right.
it.
That's my point. But
Yeah.
I think that if you that's not the only thing in life. Like, I think that's not the only thing
Right.
Yes, you do need to take tests to get into medical school and become a doctor and such. But there are other things that I think are also very important qualities that we should want to see in human beings.
So do you think testing should be done only at the final stage? Anybody can go to med school. Don't evaluate them based on tests. But wait till they just take their boards. Let the boards be the final stage.
I've not studied medical school, so I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not.
Well, I'm just using it as an example.
Right, no,
Like,
but
what is the right?
Well, I'm looking at
point you have
K-12.
in?
I'm looking at K-12.
Okay.
So I mean, I think I've not studied
Yeah.
the practice of law or medicine, and so I can't speak on that. But in terms of the K-12 system, yeah, I'm all in favor of having these progressive schools, the public progressive schools in New York. They have regular performance-based tests and checking out what the kids are working on. And if you're in a small school, you don't even necessarily need those tests. If you have a strong relationship and the teacher knows where you are, the teacher can individually determine where you stand on a certain subject, and they can mark where you are. That's obviously a very ideal situation. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having a few assessments here and there in these schools, and they do so.
So to conclude, you're saying that K through 12 public schools, progressive schools, and democratic makes sense, but like undergrad or grad or anything after, you would keep the way it is.
Well, I can't. I'm not saying I'll necessarily keep the way it is, but I've just not studied the grad system as much.
Okay.
But I mean, I find that a lot of graduate schools, at least I haven't studied the American system very much, but the UK system, there are very few tests. A lot of it is very based on submitting essays and research and the work you do, at least in the humanities. At least in the
And oral exams.
And oral exams, yeah. At Oxford and Cambridge, that's essentially what you do. You have oral exams, and
Right.
and they have. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge have the tutorial system where you have a tutor. You go to that tutor. It's like one-on-one instruction in a very individual-based approach. And yeah, I think an oral exam is a much better way to tell whether you know something as opposed to taking a standardized test or a traditional test. But yeah, I think it's those. I mean, I'd love to see more oral exams to happen in school. So, yeah, I again, that's maybe another topic for the future. But K-12, I think that's what I'd like to see.
Okay, we can also open the floor for any Q&A. Sure.
Nikhil, thank you. It was really an amazing discussion. I enjoyed it. I had this question. You're talking about the democratic process in schools, but who decides whether students need to go to this kind of school or to another kind of process? Is this a role of parents, districts, federal government? What do you think?
Yeah, well, most democratic schools, as I mentioned, are private. So that's obviously a parent's decision to do that. But there are these alternative schools. The problem with the alternative schools is that a lot of them are oftentimes only reserved for kids who are in special education or completely disengaged or ready to drop out. They're not necessarily for the kids who are like just going by school, getting A's, B's, C's, like just going by. So that's often a district or a teacher recommends a student to go into this program. But yeah, it's a lot of it is parents. I think an individual district can decide to set up a progressive school. So the Workshop School, for example, is a school that was founded by Simon Hogger and a couple other people in 2013, and it was sanctioned by the School District of Philadelphia. So I think school districts can play a role in helping to create more of these types of schools.
Yeah, I mean, so you obviously want to have it on much grander scale than it is now.
Well, starting off, I'd love to see. Yeah,
who will drive this?
Well, I think policymakers can do a lot of good in that. I think, like I mentioned, I think pilot programs. I think why don't we start a couple of these programs in schools and study them around the country, or at least send a group of officials from the Department of Education or state departments of education to these schools, and let's see the effectiveness and look at this research on a larger scale. And I think starting with a school, like in a school, you could have like a group of students trying this out and seeing whether it works and seeing how it functions. I would really encourage that to happen, and schools can do that themselves. Policymakers can do that, and then individual educators can advocate for those changes in their districts. So it comes from different places. It's not necessarily just one person, but certainly if the Secretary of Education wants to do this, I would love to see that happen. But it's very unlikely that he would want to do that.
So in your ideal world, if your kind of idea of how education should be K-12 were to roll out, how would you see that happening? And what would it look like?
Well, I think one of my favorite models is the School Without Walls model. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to try out in a couple cities where there'd be partnerships between local community agencies, the government, and school districts, where I think there would be kind of like a database system where people can get matched based on like an apprenticeship or internship they work on, and match with adults in that community. And then I think there could be areas where you could have classes and activities available for kids. One of the examples I talk about in the book is in Chicago, they have the Cities of Learning initiative, where the kids in a summer program, because a lot of kids who don't have access to summer camps are oftentimes just playing on the street. They don't have any real opportunities. They called it the Summer of Learning, where they had a database of activities where kids could earn digital badges based on the activities that they worked on. And that was a really good way to get poor kids in these activities and learn skills and gain knowledge. And so I'd like to see that happen. It's happening in Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and a couple of other cities. So I'd like to see a kind of database where kids can choose the activities they're most interested in. And then you could obviously streamline that based on individual schools and teachers. But I like to, again, these are obviously very sometimes far-fetched ideas. I would start with a pilot program and seeing where it goes from there.
Sure. That's okay.
Hi, so you mentioned in passing AMC medical schools are moving towards a more whole person-based evaluation of students, and as opposed to just strictly objective, do you pass these requirements? That's all well and good. The problem is, well, one concern is that raises the cost of evaluating students, and that would be particularly important from the high school to college level and college to post-secondary level. And one of the impacts would be to potentially reduce the number of students who can access education, because oftentimes application fees are not refundable
Right.
and not really covered under any sort of financial aid. Is there any, do you have any ideas on how to address that problem?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the cost, I think obviously I'm a big favor of a free higher education, and I think that it would include applying to college. That there should be at least waivers or in place where kids can for application fees, because it can be quite exorbitant after some time. But yeah, I mean it is portfolio-based assessment. At least there's about 850 colleges in this country that no longer require the SAT or ACT for admissions. These are, schools like NYU, Wake Forest, a lot of liberal arts colleges, Bennington, Hampshire, others. They don't require the SAT or ACT. They actually, some of these, they ask for students to submit a portfolio of a project they did or a paper. Bard, I think, announced a couple of years ago that students could submit 4 2,500 word essays graded by a teacher. I think those are kind of interesting models to look at. But yeah, cost is a big factor for how, because it will take more time to evaluate those applications. I was hearing kind of one proposal where a school could kind of, if you got a lower, say a school doesn't want to move towards that system, say you have you could have a situation where a school could say to a kid, say you have a lower than, 2,000 SAT score, then you could submit an extra portfolio or something that shows that you're capable of certain tasks. So that could be a way for students to show that they're able to do things beyond a standardized test. And it might be a little bit more cost effective than asking every kid to submit a portfolio. So I think there's kind of innovative approaches to that, and I think a lot of liberal arts colleges are moving in that direction, even if they haven't done so already.
Nevertheless, there's still a lot of back-end costs. And my last job was actually admissions processing, and it's still archaic. Transcripts are physically mailed around.
Right.
Would you propose any incentives to perhaps streamline or modernize that system? Yeah,
I'm forgetting the name, but there is a consortium of schools, of colleges, that was recently announced that was talking about this. Like, they were trying to create a much more portfolio-based approach. I think there was a couple Ivy League schools, Stanford, that were saying that we need to make it easier for kids to apply to college, and I think include digital transcripts, or at least making that process streamlined. I'm forgetting the name, but there was something about that recently.
Yeah, I didn't hear anything about that last job. All right, yeah, it's just a concern of mine. It's something I've been kicking around the back of my head, because it is a real cost.
Yeah.
And I've only seen applications become more onerous on students, not less.
Right.
So I guess more of a comment than question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I had a question about, as you move to this system being more widespread, if you can get it past the pilot stage, you would probably have to train teachers in how to teach in this new system. How do you propose to do that on a large scale?
I think that's actually probably the second biggest challenge. Really transforming graduate education schools. And I don't think I have an answer to that, because it is a monumental task. And I think that's probably, even if you have the pilot program in place, and you have teachers who are trained in a way that is very traditional, it's going to falter. So, I'd like to see graduate education schools change, but I have not seen any movement on that regard in higher education. But yeah, it's a very good point. It's something that I think we need to talk about more.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Nikhil. Everybody, please check out his book, Schools on Trial, with a very catchy byline on how freedom and creativity can fix our educational malpractice.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.